Imagine you're a scientist, right? And you're running this massive, highly complex global experiment. You have
Yeah.
test subjects all over the world. But to know if your results are actually and not just some fluke or contamination or, subjects whispering answers to each other in the waiting room, you absolutely need a control group.
You have to have one.
Yeah, right. You need a subject locked in a completely sealed, impenetrable vault, totally isolated from all the others. And if that isolated subject suddenly starts showing the exact same highly specific, bizarre symptoms as everyone else in your exposed group.
Well, then you know you're looking at something profound.
Exactly. You can't blame it on cross-contamination. Something much, much deeper is going on. So whether you're taking a break from work or you just have an insanely curious mind, welcome. We have an incredible historical mystery to unpack for you today on this deep dive.
We really do. And that mystery challenges the very foundation of how we understand human history. We are looking at the research of William J. Oxfield today, specifically his extensive work on cross-cultural mythology.
It's fascinating stuff.
It is. And the core question we're exploring for you today is this. What if the foundational stories of human civilization, the ones we usually dismiss as pure myth or metaphor or just fairy tales around the campfire?
Right, the stuff we think is just made up.
Exactly. What if those are actually fragmented memories of literal real events?
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to test Oxfield's theory, we are going into that sealed vault I just mentioned. Our geographic focus for today's deep dive is ancient China.
Yes.
Now, just a quick heads up for you listening. Oxfield's work touches on some deeply held religious texts, specifically ancient texts like Genesis and apocryphal Jewish writings.
Right, we can be sensitive.
Very sensitive. So our goal today isn't to validate or debunk anyone's theology. We aren't here to preach or take sides. We are just mapping out Oxfield's historical theory based on the sources provided. Looking at these ancient documents purely as potential historical data points.
I think that framing is essential because ancient China really serves as our scientific control group here. We are using it to test what Oxfield terms the Watcher narrative.
Right, the Watchers.
Yeah, this is the ancient, globally widespread story of divine or semi-divine beings descending to Earth. And they transfer forbidden knowledge or advanced technology to primitive humanity, and ultimately, well, they spark a catastrophic cosmic reset.
Which is usually remembered in the text as a global flood.
Exactly,
Right.
a massive flood. So if this narrative is just a campfire story that people traded back and forth along ancient highways, or, if it's just a psychological coping mechanism, well, our control group should expose that.
Right, it should be totally different. But before we can even look at the evidence inside Chinese mythology, we really have to establish the walls of that vault.
The isolation part.
Yeah, we have to understand the why and the how of China's geographic location. Why does this specific region make it the ultimate laboratory test for human history?
Well, to fully appreciate the anomaly of China, you have to consider how academia usually explains away the inconvenient fact
Right.
that wildly different, totally disconnected cultures share the exact same myths.
Right, because they do. Everywhere.
They do. And there are generally two standard academic safety nets for this. The first is the Jungian theory, which is based on Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious.
So basically treating human brains like they're all running the exact same psychological operating system, like we all have the same base code.
That is a great way to visualize it, yeah. The Jungian model argues that humans share certain underlying hardwired fears and needs.
Like what?
Well, for example, every ancient agricultural society lived in mortal terror of river floods destroying their crops.
Sure, that makes sense.
So the theory goes, every society independently invented a myth about a world-destroying flood to process that shared psychological anxiety. It's a structural similarity born entirely from human nature.
Not share history.
Right, not shared history.
I mean, that makes perfect sense for broad, generic concepts, fear of the dark, fear of floods, wanting a hero to save the day. But then we have the second academic safety net, which is the diffusionist theory.
Yeah, the diffusionist theory looks at cultural exchange. It essentially argues that cultures simply traded their stories along with their physical goods.
Like bartering.
Exactly. The ancient Greeks and the Mesopotamians, they shared maritime and overland trade routes, so it's perfectly logical that a merchant selling grain would also swap mythological details about the gods.
Here's some wheat, and by the way, let me tell you about Zeus.
Pretty much. Or the ancient Hebrews, they were physically relocated during the Babylonian exile, so they naturally absorbed and adapted Mesopotamian flood narratives. The exposed groups were physically interacting.
They were cross-contaminating the data.
Right.
But here is where the geography of ancient China just completely shatters both of those standard explanations. If you think about the topography of Asia, I mean, you have the Himalayas, which is effectively a 20,000-foot high jagged concrete wall.
It's impassable.
Totally. And you have the deadly expanse of the Gobi and Taklamakan deserts. You have the Tibetan Plateau. China was geographically and culturally locked off from the ancient Near East in a way that is, frankly, hard for us to fathom today.
It really is. And to put a date on it, the Silk Road, which is the very first documented trade route connecting China to the West, it didn't even open until approximately 130 BC under Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty.
Wow, 130 BC.
Yeah, keep that 130 BC date in mind as we move forward. Because before that date, there's absolutely zero documented contact between these two spheres of human civilization.
None at all.
None.
Yeah.
No Mesopotamian clay tablets ever survived a journey to the Yellow River Valley. No Hebrew scribes were visiting the courts of the Shang dynasty. No Greek philosophers were wandering the Gobi Desert penning letters to Confucius.
They were completely walled off.
Completely.
Huh.
They developed in complete parallel isolation across the exact same centuries that produced the Book of Genesis, the Book of Enoch, and the earliest Sumerian epics.
See, if you're listening to this and thinking, well, wait, couldn't a lone traveler have just wandered over and traded a story? You have to remember the sheer hostility of that landscape. It's exactly like that double-blind medical trial I mentioned.
Right.
If the completely isolated control group suddenly exhibits the exact same highly specific, bizarre symptoms as the exposed group, you cannot blame it on contact. And if the symptoms are way too detailed, way too granular to just be a universal human anxiety about rivers flooding, well, you can't blame it on Jungian psychology either.
Which forces us to look at what we actually find when we pry open the oldest records of that isolated control group.
And what do we find?
Well, we don't just find vague stories of floods or generic heroes bringing fire. We find a highly specific curriculum of knowledge that, according to standard evolutionary models of history, simply shouldn't exist there in this format.
Okay, let's get into the specifics of that curriculum. Because when you look at the absolute oldest layer of Chinese mythology, it introduces these foundational figures known as the three sovereigns.
Yes, the three sovereigns.
And they aren't described as fully human, but they aren't fully divine either. They're very specifically described as descending from above to a pre-civilizational humanity with one mission, and that is to teach them.
And the curriculum they taught is startling in its precision. First, you have the figure of Shennong, who is known as the divine farmer.
Okay.
Tradition says he was part human, part divine. But he didn't just teach generic farming. He taught advanced agriculture, the specific mechanics of the plow, the astronomical calendar necessary for planting, and herbal medicine.
Wait, herbal medicine too?
Yeah, the texts actually say he literally tested hundreds of poisonous plants on his own body to document their pharmacological properties for humanity.
That is incredibly specific. Okay, so that's Shennong, and then you have Fuxi.
Right, Fuxi. He's credited with teaching hunting, the domestication of animals, the first principles of writing, and divination.
Specifically creating the 8 trigrams, right?
Yes. And for those unfamiliar, the 8 trigrams are the complex foundation of all Chinese astronomical and divinatory calculation.
Okay, so we've got agriculture, botany, writing, and divination. And the third one.
Finally, there is Huangdi, the legendary Yellow Emperor. He is credited with bringing advanced medicine, the observation of the stars for astronomy, and the complex arts of metallurgy and war.
Wow.
So keep that specific syllabus in your mind. Agriculture and botany, writing, divination, astrology, astronomy, metallurgy, and warfare.
Okay, before we cross-reference this, let's provide a little context for you listening. What actually is the Book of Enoch? Because for anyone who hasn't spent their weekend reading ancient apocryphal scrolls, this might sound completely foreign.
Sure, it's not exactly light beach reading.
Right. We are pulling out a text from the ancient Near East, written thousands of miles away from China, separated by deserts and mountains. What is it?
So, First Enoch is an ancient Jewish religious work, and parts of it date back to roughly 300 BC. It was famously found among the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Okay.
And it expands heavily on a very brief, cryptic passage in the Book of Genesis about the quote-unquote sons of God descending to earth.
Ah, right.
But 1 Enoch focuses intensely on the illicit technology transfer that occurred when these beings, called the Watchers or fallen angels, descended to Mount Hermon.
And when you open 1 Enoch, specifically chapter 8, you find the grand indictment against these Watchers. The text lists the exact forbidden knowledge they transferred to early humanity.
The exact same list.
Yeah. Azazel taught metallurgy and the making of weapons of war. Penemu taught the art of writing with ink and paper. Burakiel taught astrology and the reading of the stars. Kazdeja taught medicine, specifically the properties of roots and plants.
It's uncanny. We're looking at two totally isolated civilizations, and they both claim that human civilization was not a slow, independent crawl out of the cave.
They don't describe thousands of years of trial and error.
No, they don't. They both claim civilization was a sudden, explosive transfer of highly specific technical knowledge from non-human intelligences.
I mean, the curriculum is structurally identical. We are talking about metallurgy, astronomy, herbal medicine, and writing. A Jungian, quote-unquote, culture hero invented by a terrified human brain could teach literally anything.
Right, anything at all.
He could teach how to build a boat, or how to weave baskets, or, I don't know, how to sing. The fact that both isolated zones focus on this exact, specific syllabus across the Eurasian landmass, well, that is a textual parallel, not just a psychological archetype.
What's fascinating here is that it raises a critical point about how these societies viewed this sudden technological leap.
Well, I have to push back here, though, because there is a massive glaring difference in how this story is told.
Okay, what do you mean?
The Book of Enoch treats this knowledge transfer as a terrible cosmic crime. It's a transgression that corrupts the earth, it introduces brutal warfare, and ultimately it forces the creator to trigger a global flood to wipe the slate clean. But the ancient Chinese texts treat these three sovereigns as absolute heroes. I mean, Shennong is celebrated for sacrificing himself to test poisons. The Yellow Emperor is revered. Why the massive moral flip?
That's a great question. And Oxfield's overarching theory, specifically what he calls the Babel dispersion mechanism, actually predicts this exact moral divergence.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
Let me see if I can guess how this works.
Let's go for it.
So the theory proposes that humanity, at some point after this flood event, shared a single unified oral memory of what happened. They knew about the beings who descended and the syllabus they brought.
Right.
But when that unified population was scattered across the globe, which is the event remembered in the Near East as the scattering at the Tower of Babel, they took those fragmented memories with them into deep isolation.
You're tracking perfectly. They took the core memory into isolation. And over centuries, as languages mutated and these splinter groups adapted to vastly different, often brutal environments, well, their moral lens shifted to justify their survival.
But wait, I still have to challenge that timeline. You're telling me a scattered tribe wanders across Asia, settles by the Yellow River, and thousands of years later, they still perfectly remember a syllabus of forbidden knowledge.
Yes.
I mean, have you ever played the game Telephone? An oral story degrades into total static in a week, let alone millennia.
It's an excellent challenge. But it's where we have to distinguish between a casual campfire story and a foundational survival myth.
Okay, how so?
In the game of Telephone, the phrase, "the cat sat on the mat," changes because there are no stakes. It doesn't matter if you get it wrong. But when an oral tradition contains the origin of your agriculture, your calendar, and your writing system, the very technologies keeping your tribe alive in a harsh world, that narrative is protected fiercely.
Oh, that makes sense.
The names of the figures mutate, sure. The language changes. But the core structural pillars, the syllabus itself, those become locked into the cultural DNA.
Ah, I see. So the cultural spin changes depending on the society's trajectory.
Right.
One culture in the Near East looks back at the sudden injection of advanced weapons and says, that corrupted our natural order and led to our destruction.
Right.
And another culture, trying to survive on the frozen steppes or the plains of China, looks at the exact same injection of technology and says, thank goodness those beings gave us the plow and herbal medicine, or we would have starved to death.
That's exactly it. The moral judgment fractures, but the memory of the event itself remains perfectly intact. And connecting this to the bigger picture explains why the differences in these global myths are actually the strongest evidence for them being real.
Because if they just copied it, it would be identical.
Precisely. If the ancient Chinese had simply copied a Mesopotamian clay tablet, the stories would be identical in their moral outrage. The fact that the Chinese version has a completely opposite moral valence proves they didn't borrow it. They remembered it independently and interpreted it through their own survival lens.
Wow. Okay, so the curriculum of these semi-divine teachers matches the ancient Near East perfectly. But if these beings were just the middle management bringing the syllabus, who was the principal?
Who was in charge?
Right, who was at the top of the cosmic hierarchy? Because this transitions us from the semi-divine teachers to the absolute creator. And this brings up a detail in the Chinese records that completely blew my mind.
It is arguably the most significant and definitely most overlooked parallel of all. We have to look at the oracle bones.
Let's explain what those are. We are talking about the absolute oldest recoverable layer of Chinese writing, dating back to the Shang dynasty, roughly between 1600 and 1046 BC.
Very old.
Yeah, and these aren't scrolls. These are literal ox scapulae and tortoise shells. Diviners would carve questions into the bone, apply an intensely hot bronze pin until the bone cracked, and then they'd read the fractures to determine the will of heaven.
And carved into those ancient bones is the name of the supreme deity, Shangdi, which translates to Emperor Above or Highest Sovereign.
And what is vital for you, the listener, to understand is that Shangdi is not a nature god.
No, not at all.
He is not a localized god of the Yellow River or god of the sun or god of the wheat harvest. He is explicitly described in these early texts as the absolute, invisible, unrepresented, supreme creator of all things.
There are no idols of Shangdi. There are no statues. The earliest Chinese emperors offered what was called the border sacrifice directly to Shangdi.
Wow.
This wasn't polytheism where one god just happens to be the strongest in a crowded pantheon of competing deities. This mirrors the strict invisible monotheism of the pre-Babel Genesis account. It is a single, sovereign creator god above all other spiritual beings, the one who ultimately commands the universe.
I think of it like a pristine architectural blueprint, because if you look at classical Chinese religions centuries later, you see a rich, complex polytheism.
Oh, absolutely.
You see localized deities, intense ancestor worship, river dragons. It looks like someone took that pristine blueprint and just smudged it, drawing all sorts of new rooms and additions over the centuries. But if you dig all the way down to the foundational layer, that Shang Dynasty bone-deep blueprint, you wipe away the centuries of smudges and you find a single invisible creator.
And this creates a massive problem for the psychological models we discussed earlier. Because, left to our own psychological devices, human beings naturally lean heavily toward animism and polytheism.
We want to see faces and things.
Exactly. We desperately want to see the divine in the river that waters our crops, in the tree that gives us shade, in the storm that threatens our homes. We want a god we can carve out of wood, put on a shelf, and offer grain to in exchange for favors.
It's comforting. I mean, it makes a terrifying, unpredictable world feel manageable and transactional.
Yes. Strict, invisible monotheism, a god who cannot be seen, manipulated, or represented by human hands, is deeply counterintuitive to ancient human psychology.
It doesn't make sense for them to just invent it.
It doesn't. Therefore, the independent preservation of a strict, invisible monotheism in ancient, isolated China strongly argues for a common historical origin. It means the Hebrew tradition preserving the invisible Yahweh and the Chinese tradition preserving the invisible Shangdi are two ends of the Eurasian continent, holding on to the exact same original theological memory before human psychology had time to fragment it into polytheism.
So our sealed vault holds the Watcher curriculum, and it holds the original invisible creator.
Right.
But up until now, we've been talking about prehistory. We've been deep in the mythological origins, around 1600 BC and earlier.
Be past.
If this theoretical vault of China is truly capturing echoes of a shared reality, does it ever react to the exposed group in the Near East during documented, datable history?
It does. And this fine parallel drops right into the middle of recorded imperial history, completely challenging everything we think we know about cultural isolation. We're moving rapidly forward in time to the later Han Dynasty.
Okay.
Specifically, the official records from the 7th year of the reign of Emperor Guangwu.
And depending on how historians calculate the first year of his reign, this date is placed precisely between 31 and 33 AD.
Which happens to be the exact window, heavily debated by historians and scholars, for the crucifixion of Jesus in the Roman province of Judea.
Let that sink in for a second. In the official Chinese historical records, the highly bureaucratic imperial annals for that specific time, there is an entry documenting a solar eclipse.
Yes.
And the text of this official state-sanctioned record translates to this. Yin and yang have mistakenly switched, and the sun and moon were eclipsed. The sins of all the people are now on one man. Pardon is proclaimed to all under heaven.
And it doesn't stop there. There are additional entries from the exact same period. Another official note reads, "Eclipse on the day of Gi-hai. Man from heaven died."
Unbelievable.
And then, exactly 3 days after the eclipse, the imperial record notes a highly unusual atmospheric phenomenon, a halo or a rainbow, completely encircling the sun.
Okay, I want to deliberately pump the brakes here, because if you're listening and feeling a bit of whiplash, I am right there with you.
It's a lot to process.
It is. As a critical reader, my immediate thought is, well, isn't it highly likely this is just standard political PR?
How do you mean?
I mean, Chinese emperors always took ritual blame when cosmic omens happened. An eclipse happens, the peasants get terrified, it's bad luck. So the emperor puts out a bureaucratic press release saying, I take the sins of the people on myself. The mandate of heaven is secure. Please don't overthrow me.
Your skepticism is not only valid, it's really the only responsible way to handle this text. You are structurally correct. The language of an emperor bearing the sins of the people in response to a cosmic disruption like an eclipse, it is a known imperial formula.
Right, a ritual assumption of responsibility.
Exactly. We cannot, and we absolutely should not, definitively claim this proves the Han court was supernaturally witnessing a crucifixion thousands of miles away.
But the convergence of the data points makes it impossible to just ignore. The impartial, honest framing here isn't to say this is definitive proof of the supernatural. The honest framing is to say this official record exists. The timing between 31 and 33 AD is mathematically remarkable. The specific language sins on one man, pardon proclaimed to all under heaven. Man from heaven died. It maps onto the central historical claim of Christianity with eerie precision.
It really does.
And the atmospheric anomaly recorded exactly 3 days later just adds another layer of bizarre coincidence. So we're putting this on the table for you, the listener, to decide what to make of it.
Because it forces a deeply uncomfortable question for historians. If it is merely imperial boilerplate, why does the boilerplate of this completely isolated, heavily fortified civilization just happen to perfectly mirror the most consequential historical moment happening a continent away in the exact same year?
Right.
The Han Emperor had absolutely no mundane way of knowing what was happening to a carpenter in a Roman backwater province. It's a piece of evidence that refuses to sit quietly in the coincidence box.
It really refuses. So what does this all mean? We covered a massive amount of ground today. Why should you, sitting in traffic or folding laundry right now, care about oracle bones, or the botanical experiments of Shenong, or Han Dynasty eclipse records?
Why does it matter?
Exactly. It matters because Oxfield's research fundamentally shifts the paradigm of human knowledge. If China, the ultimate, perfectly isolated, geographically walled-off control group, preserves the exact Watcher curriculum of forbidden knowledge,
Okay.
if it preserves the highly counterintuitive memory of an invisible monotheistic creator,
Yeah?
and if it logs these highly specific, resonant historical markers with zero physical contact with the West, it means we have to rethink the word myth.
They are not fictions born from a collective psychological anxiety. They are not stories traded for grain. They are fragmented memories of a shared human reality.
Shared reality.
Yeah. The stories of our origins were not the same because all humans simply think the same thoughts. The stories are the same because all humans at our very origin once knew the exact same events.
When that original unified population was scattered by the Babel dispersion, they packed up those foundational memories and carried them into the freezing steppes, the deep jungles, and the walled-off valleys of the earth.
Everywhere.
We've spent centuries looking at these traditions, Greek, Hebrew, Mayan, Chinese, and assumed we were looking at completely different books written by different authors. But Oxfield's control group suggests we were just looking at torn pages from the exact same diary.
The implications are staggering. It means the ancient texts we've arrogantly relegated to the mythology section of the library might actually belong in the history section.
And that leaves us with one final lingering thought for you to chew on today.
What's that?
If every dispersed culture on Earth retained a tiny, highly specific fragment of this original memory, a memory of a time when the divine realm physically interacted with ours, transferring unimaginable knowledge and facing catastrophic judgment, what exactly is going to happen when those isolated fragments finally start to reassemble in our modern, hyper-connected world? Because if ancient China proved the experiment was real, that means the vault is no longer sealed.